Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us here at the King's College today for our event featuring the subject of political violence in American history. Today's event is one that really demonstrates the very essence of what it is to be a part of the King's College community. We are not a college that sidesteps the difficult issues, whether it's in a classroom environment or in a broader public setting. So we're very thankful that you're able to join us for this discussion today. Today's panel will be moderated by Dr. Jacqueline Rivers, who's the Executive Director and Senior Fellow for Science and Policy of the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies. Fortunately for us, she is also a Senior Fellow at the King's College in New York City and a longtime friend of the efforts to educate and engage the ideas that are so relevant during today's environment. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Rivers.
I just wanted to thank you very much, President Gibson. It is a real pleasure to be associated with King's College, and I really am enjoying my course so far. The students are really engaged and just doing a wonderful job. So I want to take this opportunity now to introduce the speakers who are going to be a part of this discussion. And let me start with, I can get my screen to open up. Let me start with Professor David Tubbs. He earned his PhD in politics at Princeton University, concentrating in political philosophy, constitutional law, and Russian studies, and began teaching at King's in August 2005. In his scholarship, he writes on topics in political philosophy and constitutional law and contemporary controversies in public policy. His book, Freedom's Orphans, was published by Princeton University Press in 2007. And in spring 2010, Professor Tubbs received the Faculty of the Year Award for Academic Excellence given by students at the college. He's lectured internationally very widely and was previously visiting faculty fellow at Irkutsk State University in Irkutsk, Russia, and the W.H. Brady Visiting Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., along with a number of other prestigious positions. We're honored to have you with us again, Dr. Tubbs. After Dr. Tubbs speaks, we will hear from Dr. Matthew Parks, who earned his PhD in political science at Boston University after majoring in math and political science at Dickinson College. He has spent his career in education, serving for 7 years as a headmaster and principal teacher at Exeter Classical Christian School before coming to King's. He has written and spoken on the founders, Abraham Lincoln, the generation of American statesmen in between, the principles of Republican government, and the role of the natural law in civil legislation. For the last several years, his research has focused on the Federalist. From 2013 to 15, he co-authored with David Corbin, The Federalist Today, a series of essays connecting principles of the Federalist to contemporary politics, featured or published by numerous outlets. He was born in London while his father was stationed in England with the US Navy, but lived in Pennsylvania for most of his youth. We're honored to have Dr. Parks with us today. Following Dr. Parks, we'll hear from Dr. Anthony Bradley, who is a professor of religious studies and director of the Center for the Study of Human Flourishing at the King's College. Dr. Bradley is also a research fellow at the Acton Institute. He lectures at colleges, universities, business organizations, conferences, and churches throughout the US and abroad. His writings on religious and cultural issues have been published in a variety of journals, including the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Washington Examiner, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Detroit News, Christianity Today, and World Magazine. He's called upon by members of the broadcast media for comment on current issues and has appeared on C-SPAN, NPR, CNN Headline News, and Fox News, among others. He studies and writes about issues of race in America, mass incarceration and overcriminalization, youth and family, welfare, education, and ethics. We're very glad to have Dr. Bradley with us. And our final speaker today will be Joseph Loconte. Dr. Loconte is a senior fellow in Christianity and culture at the King's College and the director of the Simon Center for American Studies at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. From 2009 to 2020, he served as an associate professor of history at King's, where he taught courses on Western civilization and a number of other topics. He also served as a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. In 2008, he was named a distinguished visiting professor at the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University. He has been a frequent contributor to print and broadcast media. For 10 years, he was a regular commentator on religion and the public square for National Public Radio's All Things Considered. He's the author of several books, including the New York Times bestseller, A Hobbit, A Wardrobe, and a Great War, How J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis Rediscovered Faith, Friendship, and Heroism in the Cataclysm of 1914 to 1918. In addition to that, he has several other publications. He's a native of Brooklyn, New York, and we are very pleased to have him with us today. He is always both insightful and, I find, incredibly engaging and entertaining. So with that, I'd like to make a few remarks on political violence myself. So you will hear today from many of the speakers that political violence did not start on 9/11. Political violence in the United States did not start on 9/11, which I think for young people might be the way it seems. Certainly that's when the media starts paying the greatest attention to it in recent times. And I think for a lot of us, political violence may be associated with the idea of terrorism, but foreign terrorism. However, there's been a long history of domestic terrorism. And I want to just remind us that really with the violence of white supremacists after emancipation in the mid to late 19th century, the Ku Klux Klan terrorized Black people in the South with the goal of suppressing the Black vote, which in fact was extremely successful, along with other strategies. And that kind of domestic terrorism targeted at Black people continued throughout the Jim Crow era. One other thing I would just say quickly is that the idea of violating the tradition of the peaceful transfer of power, we have to recognize that that was violated perhaps most recent, prior to January 6th, it was violated in 2017 in protests surrounding the inauguration of then President Trump. I want to point out differences, though. I'm sure that some of our upcoming speakers will address this question of the attack on the Capitol, the insurrectionist attack on January 6th. But I want to point out that these demonstrations, even though they became violent in 2017, were very different from that attack on the Capitol. First of all, they were on a much smaller scale. In addition to that, they were not directed at the very center, the very heart of government. They were not directed against the Capitol. They were in the streets of Washington, D.C., blocks from the inauguration parade, I have to admit. They also occurred in other cities. No one died, at least as far as I could find from my research. No one died in any of those protests, and there were many more arrests around those protests than there were initially in 2021. The question you might also be asking is, what about violence by Antifa or Black Lives Matter? And so I want to share some of the latest data from a report from the Department of Homeland Security. An October 2020 report from the Department of Homeland Security found that the primary terrorist threat inside the United States will stem from lone offenders, including domestic violent extremists, what they call DVEs. Among domestic violent extremists, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically white supremacist extremists, or what they call WSEs, will remain the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland. White supremacist extremists will remain the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland. Since 2018, they have conducted more lethal attacks in the United States than have any other domestic violent extremist movement. The chart below comes from the same report. I am about to share that chart. There you go. It comes from the same report, this report from the Department of Homeland Security. And it goes on to state that in 2019, the most lethal year for domestic violent extremism in the United States since the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, among domestic violent extremist actors, white supremacist extremists conducted half of all lethal attacks, 8 out of 16, resulting in the majority of deaths, 39 out of 48. That's what's captured in that chart. As the chart reveals, the impact of foreign terrorist groups is negligible in comparison to that of white supremacists. White supremacists launched more attacks than any other group of homegrown violent extremists. And these are extremists who are influenced by foreign terrorist groups and inflicted almost 40 times as many fatalities. So the real danger is not from foreign terrorists, but in fact, domestic violence, domestic terrorism, which is primarily white supremacist. This was confirmed by the director of the Bureau of Federal Investigation in a statement before the House Homeland Security Committee for the Congress. I will just add quickly that the Military Times quotes a military official addressing the issue of an increase in right-wing extremist activity in the armed forces and says, "We clearly recognize the threat from domestic extremists, particularly those who espouse white supremacist or white nationalist ideologies in the ranks of the military." So I just want to emphasize that the danger in the United States at the moment is primarily from white extremists. I want to also point out that a lot of this arises, it's related to, I don't want to suggest that this is a primary cause, but it is intensified by the echo chamber effect that we're now suffering in the United States, both through cable news, where the cable news stations are so clearly either conservative or liberal and present the news very much from that perspective, or through social media. So it is really incumbent upon all of us in pursuit of reducing the level of polarization, tension, and violence in the country to diversify our sources of information, to recognize that we've got to hear from people on the right and on the left. Psychological studies show that when we are simply talking to people who share our opinions, those opinions grow more extreme. So I encourage us all to ensure that we are indeed participating in a variety of news from a variety of sources. And with that, I'd like to hand this off to Professor David Tubbs for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rivers. I understand that the focus of today's panel is political violence in American history, but I would like to begin by considering a few matters in the realm of legal philosophy. After this, I'll turn to some historical developments and constitutional law relating to political violence in the First Amendment of the Constitution. I begin with these philosophical musings about the law and acts of individual violence outside the realm of politics. Human beings are distinguished from other living creatures, in part by our capacity to resist or ignore aggressive impulses and provocations to violence, such as taunts, insults, and fighting words. In an individual human, aggressive impulses may arise as an emotional response to something deeply distressing, which can impair, at least temporarily, our rationality. Aggressive impulses may also arise as part of our innate or biological mechanism to protect ourselves from grievous bodily harm. Outside the realm of politics, the law typically assigns more blame to a person whose violent actions were planned or premeditated. To simplify a point, cold-blooded violence is deemed worse than hot-blooded violence or crimes of passion. And the former, cold-blooded violence, is typically punished much more harshly than the latter. But in the sphere of politics, acts of violence are harder to characterize. Political violence can be perpetrated by an individual or a group, and the acts themselves may arise spontaneously or as a result of careful planning. Think, for example, of the violence associated with a lynch mob, and compare that with the meticulous planning of Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. Because of complexities like these, the Supreme Court of the United States has put forth other criteria to help it decide cases dealing with the advocacy of political violence and the First Amendment guarantees of freedom of speech and of the press. The pivotal terms in this area of constitutional law are the following three: advocacy, incitement, and true threats. Once again, advocacy, incitement, and true threats. Let me discuss each in turn. For most of American history, open advocacy of violence as a means of accomplishing political, economic, or social reform was unprotected by the First Amendment. The grounds for this view could be summarized as follows. States and governments, meaning all duly instituted states, duly instituted governments, exist to protect people from lawlessness. And lawlessness, above all, means violations of the lives, liberties, and property of others. But when a government is properly instituted, it is supposed to have a monopoly on the use of force. A monopoly on the use of force, meaning the use of legitimate violence. That is part of social contract theory. It's a key tenet of social contract theory associated with thinkers such as Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Because the government has acquired a monopoly on the lawful use of force, it is not, according to this traditional view in American constitutional law, it is not required to tolerate advocacy of violence by citizens, because such advocacy goes against the very purpose of a state. You can see this view expressed in many Supreme Court decisions from the first half of the 20th century, cases such as Gitlow versus New York, all the way up to Dennis versus United States in 1951. Many of these cases involve the Communist Party of the United States. And again, the thinking is mere advocacy of violence is constitutionally unprotected because it goes against the very purposes of government. However noble the ends might have appeared to those people calling for the use of violence to accomplish their goals. But this traditional view regarding the constitutionally unprotected status of political advocacy of violence was abandoned by the Supreme Court in 1969 in a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio. 1969, Brandenburg versus Ohio. Clarence Brandenburg was a member of the Ku Klux Klan in Ohio, and he was convicted for violating a state law that forbade the advocacy of violence as a means to accomplish political reform. Among other remarks, Mr. Brandenburg said that if the president, Congress, and Supreme Court continue to, quote, suppress the white Caucasian race, it's possible that there might have to be revengeance taken against them. Because of this remark, in the constitutional law course at King's, we call him Clarence Revengeance Brandenburg. He wasn't sure whether he wanted to say revenge or vengeance, so he combined them and created a new and memorable word. Perhaps because of Brandenburg's struggles with the English language, the Supreme Court seems to have regarded him as a pathetic figure and overturned his conviction. In doing so, it greatly expanded the constitutional protections given to persons advocating political violence. This protection is evident in the new constitutional test introduced by the Supreme Court in this case. I would like to read this test to you now. It's a two-part test, and it is still valid as a matter of constitutional law. So it goes like this. It is permissible to advocate violence politically, or violence for the goal of accomplishing political, economic, social reform. It's permissible to advocate violence unless this advocacy is directed to inciting or promoting imminent lawless action and is actually likely to incite or produce such action. Let me quote that again to you. Advocacy of violence in the political realm is permitted unless such advocacy, quote, is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action, end quote. So you see, it's a two-part test. Both parts of the test have to be met in order for a conviction on the grounds of advocacy of political violence to be upheld. As I said, the Supreme Court and all the other courts in the United States are still following this test. It has not been overruled by the Supreme Court. The only thing that can be said about it is it had been slightly modified by another doctrine, which is called the doctrine of true threats, which I mentioned earlier. This is another noteworthy development in First Amendment law that should be mentioned before I conclude. The doctrine of true threats was put forward with, I would say, remarkable amount of clarity in the case called Virginia versus Black, which was decided in the year 2003. Virginia versus Black reiterated that true threats, which could be considered almost synonymous with another constitutional doctrine known as fighting words. In Virginia versus Black, the Supreme Court reiterated that true threats, meaning serious threats of violence against other people, are constitutionally unprotected. Virginia versus Black involved two cases of cross burning, one on private property and one as an act of criminal trespass. The cross burning that took place on private property raised questions about whether cross burning is some kind of politically protected expression, an expression of a political viewpoint that is guaranteed by the First Amendment, constitutionally protected by the First Amendment. This doctrine of true threats, that is a serious threat of violence against other people from the standpoint of a reasonable person, not from the standpoint of the person speaking or making the threat. This doctrine of true threats is clear enough in Virginia versus Black. But as I was saying earlier, in my judgment, the ruling in this case does not supersede or displace the ruling in Brandenburg versus Ohio, because cross burning is, in the lexicon of the First Amendment, speech plus conduct. That is, cross burning is not considered pure speech. It's a hybrid. It is speech plus conduct. So I want to conclude with one final thought about the Brandenburg ruling. And I encourage you, if you're curious about this, to look at the matter and decide for yourself. Since January 6th, many Americans, many commentators have suggested that then President Donald Trump incited the attack on the Capitol that afternoon. But I have read his speech very closely, and I believe that if one reads his speech closely and then compares it with what the Supreme Court said in Brandenburg, specifically in the Brandenburg test, then President Trump's speech would have to be regarded as constitutionally protected. Now, a few other commentators have said that President Trump was culpable for incitement, not so much because of the speech, but because he so regularly repeated that the election was rigged or stolen. In this sense, he was guilty of perpetrating a lie, and the lie itself may have led to the attack on the Capitol. That's a very interesting matter, and it raises the question of how much constitutional protection does lying receive. It's beyond the scope of my presentation, but if you're curious about that, you could read another Supreme Court case called Alvarez versus United States, in which, to the surprise of many commentators, Supreme Court said that lying, outright lying, received a significant amount of constitutional protection. So that concludes my presentation. I now turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Matthew Parks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tubbs. I'm going to take us back to an earlier historical period. When Britain taxed our tea, we got frisky. Imagine what's going to happen when you try to tax our whiskey. So Thomas Jefferson warns Alexander Hamilton in a cabinet meeting reimagined by Lin-Manuel Miranda in Hamilton the Musical. It's true that old habits die hard, and an obnoxious tax is an obnoxious tax no matter where it comes from. But wasn't there a difference between 1773 and 1791? Didn't the establishment of legitimate, popularly accountable government mean, in Lincoln's memorable terms, that bullets could and should give way to ballots? The Whiskey Rebellion prophesied here by Jefferson provides a glimpse at this dilemma. But George Washington's response to it ultimately shows how judicious statesmanship can secure the peace and encourage responsible Republican politics in an age of high tension and hyper-partisanship. Since you can't see my footnotes, I'll note that I benefited from the work of several scholars in preparing these remarks: Walter McDougall, Jacob Cook, Richard Cohn, and Thomas Slaughter. So in 1791, Congress passed Alexander Hamilton's Revenue Act to begin to pay down the Revolutionary War debt and support the new national government. Included in this bill was a tax on whiskey, which drew immediate resistance in Western Pennsylvania, among other places, where whiskey was both the most widely consumed alcoholic beverage and a marketable farm product capable of being transported long distances over bad roads without spoiling. Most of this resistance took a time-tested American form: tax evasion. But by 1792, more organized resistance had emerged. Local leaders resolved to persist in legal measures that may obstruct the operation of the law, which turned out to include threats of violence against local government officials, another tactic widely used in the Revolution. Thus, the local tax collector John Neville concluded that it was neither possible to collect the tax nor even safe for him to enter Washington County, the center of resistance. That was enough to convince Hamilton that the full force of the law should be brought against the offenders, including the mobilization of troops if the courts could not do the job. Washington, too, was concerned, but also feared that any military response would be twisted to confirm the wildest fears of standing armies and military despotism that anti-federalists had raised during the debate over the Constitution. Resistance in Western Pennsylvania continued to simmer, but not quite boil, until mid-July 1794, when a mob attacked Neville in his home. This was bad enough, but the intervening 2 years had also brought a heightened tension between Hamilton and Washington's Federalist Party and Jefferson and Madison's Republican Party. Madison called the Federalists anti-Republicans, while the Republican press accused them of plotting to create a British-style monarchy. Hamilton said the Republicans wished to subvert government, while the Federalist press accused them of plotting to bring French revolutionary violence to America. In sum, by the time word of the attack on Neville reached Washington's cabinet in Philadelphia, Attorney General William Bradford could easily see it as part of a formed and regular plan for weakening and perhaps overthrowing the general government. In a letter to Virginian Charles Min Thurston, Washington saw a deeper danger inherent in the rebellion. If the laws are to be so trampled upon with impunity, and a minority, a small one too, is to dictate to the majority, there is an end put at one stroke to Republican government, and nothing but anarchy and confusion is to be expected thereafter. For some other man or society may dislike another law and oppose it with equal propriety until all laws are prostrate, and everyone, the strongest, I presume, will carve for himself. Though the Whiskey Rebellion could be framed as the resistance of the common farmer to a high-toned Federalist administration, Washington recognized that in the long run, it was the weaker part of the society that had the most at stake in the rule of law. This was not 1773 or 1775 when Washington took the reins of the Continental Army. Having established a Republican government where the people could, and in this case did, modify laws they disapproved of, there was no justification for allowing a small group of armed insurgents to suspend the operation of a law and set a precedent other similarly dissatisfied groups could use to justify their own insurgencies. The resistance would therefore have to be suppressed and the law enforced. But Washington took pains to do so in a way that would calm rather than inflame partisan passions. First, he met with Pennsylvania Governor Thomas Mifflin, a leading Republican. When it became clear Mifflin would not approve the immediate deployment of the Pennsylvania militia, Washington agreed that he would initiate any call for troops, justify the measure publicly, and then give Mifflin time to convene the legislature and open negotiations with the rebels. 2 days later, Supreme Court Justice James Wilson certified, under the Militia Act, that in 2 western Pennsylvania counties, the laws of the United States were opposed or the execution thereof obstructed by combinations too powerful to be suppressed by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings or local law enforcement. This gave Washington the legal power to call out the militia in Pennsylvania, and if necessary, adjoining states, which he began to do in a proclamation 3 days later. In the same proclamation, he also called upon those who had taken up treasonous arms against federal officials to disperse before September 1st, hinting that he might extend clemency to those who did. That same day, he dispatched William Bradford to join 2 other Pennsylvania officials in negotiating with the leading rebels. Once they arrived, they quickly discovered that there was a large group of moderate opponents of the law who were afraid to stand down because they feared they would become the next victims of the violent minority. Only when it became clear that the militia would truly march, and those in that violent minority realized they would be the target of overwhelming force, did the tide begin to turn. In the meantime, as reports from the negotiators and others reached state and federal leaders in Philadelphia, the intransigent leaders of the rebellion began to be discredited in the face of Washington's reasonableness and moderation, and a bipartisan consensus emerged in favor of military intervention. On September 10th, the Philadelphia militia responded enthusiastically to Mifflin's exhortation to march. The next day, the Republican Party newspaper came out with a strong endorsement of military suppression. James Madison approved, Thomas Jefferson held his tongue, and some of the air was let out of the hyperpartisan balloon. The short-term result was almost anticlimactic. The militia, organized under the personal oversight of Washington, met no armed resistance on its march. 2 rebels were convicted of treason, then pardoned by Washington, while most took advantage of a general amnesty offered to those who would sign a loyalty pledge. The long-term effects of Washington's actions were even more salutary. Though Washington had led a military operation against American citizens, he had demonstrated that neither he nor his party, nor the federal government in general, was eager to turn tyrannical. He criticized the democratic societies, which had spoken of civil war and secession, but not the Republican Party. His opponents responded with similar moderation. While those societies began to fade in significance, Jefferson prepared to mount a political challenge to the Federalists in the election campaign of 1796. Though the tense debate over the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 was yet to come, by the time Jefferson took office as the first Republican president in 1801, there was no more talk of an anti-Republican Federalist Party. Instead, he affirmed, "Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." The next year, Congress repealed the whiskey tax. In the end, where Washington led, others followed, as bullets gave way to ballots to the ultimate benefit of all Americans. Now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Anthony Bradley.
Thanks so much, Dr. Parks. I'm delighted to be on the panel today. I have titled my remarks the sort of strange nonviolence of the Jim Crow era, because I'd like to focus our attention on just a moment on the ways in which the African American community was particularly nonviolent during a period where they received a lot of domestic violence. As Dr. Rivers noted, we began this story with the inauguration of Jim Crow and the introduction of lynching. Lynching was a means to introduce fear as a way to restrict the economic and political liberties of Blacks during the Jim Crow years. That included voting, it included running businesses, etc. And it was an execution that was brought about by a mob to execute or to punish without any lawful trial. The rule of law did not exist for these lynch mobs. The lynch mob itself exerted itself as the rule of law. The word comes from the man Charles Lynch. He was a justice of the peace who was known to administer really terrible and rough punishments. Now, what many may not realize is that whites were lynched as well. And there was a sense in which lynching, particularly in the South, was not simply targeted toward African Americans, it was also targeted toward lower class whites as well. But predominantly lynching was a way of economic and political and social control for African Americans. Sometimes they would lynch people for small offenses and sometimes what they would consider large offenses like capital murder, things like of that nature. Between 1880 and 1968, about 5,000 blacks were lynched, and these included reasons like incorrect behavior, economic competition with blacks and whites, particularly in the South. Some of these it also could have included looking at someone disrespectfully, entering an all-white establishment without permission, looking at a white woman, touching a white woman. These were all sorts of infractions that would lead to lynching. If you read Up from Slavery by Booker T. Washington, it's written around 1901, he noted that race relations were actually improving and that the Ku Klux Klan, for example, had basically disintegrated. And in 1915, a film was released, a silent film called Birth of a Nation, which is single-handedly responsible for resurrecting the Ku Klux Klan. And with that came the resurrection of lynching. Now, what's fascinating about the Birth of a Nation film and the resurrection of the Ku Klux Klan is it extended beyond the South. If anyone's seen that famous picture of the Ku Klux Klan inside a church with a sign above their heads that says, "Jesus saves," that sign in that church is a photograph from Portland, Oregon, around 1920. The state of Colorado, for example, was a state in the early 20th century, 1920s and 30s, early 40s, that was completely run by the Ku Klux Klan. And so this organization was released as a way of institutionalizing domestic violence to suppress the rights of African Americans and other minorities. And through the 1920s, nationally, the Ku Klux Klan had about 2 million members across the country. According to the Tuskegee Institute, about 90% of the victims of lynching were in the South. About 73% of those victims were Black. About 27% of those victims were white. Between 1882 and 1930, just to give some more specific detail here about which states were the most egregious at using domestic violence against African Americans. Mississippi had about 462 lynchings, Georgia 423, Louisiana 283, Alabama 262, South Carolina 143, Florida had 212, Tennessee 174, Arkansas 162, Kentucky 118, North Carolina around 75. So Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, Tennessee, these were some of the most dangerous places for African Americans to live. But the racial violence against African Americans, against sort of Black progress, was not only in rural areas, it also entered into several cities. There are a list of a number of domestic violent acts and race riots, particularly directed at African Americans. In 1906, in Atlanta, a racial tension had been building, and race baiting was in the air in the state's gubernatorial election, and that's when these tensions began to boil. Blacks in Georgia had begun to prosper economically and socially, and the Democratic candidates for governor, Hoke Smith and Clark Howell, played on whites' fear of a rising Black middle class. Anti-Black violence broke out in September of 1906 after 2 newspapers printed stories about Black men assaulting white women. Most of the allegations were false, but about 2,000 white men and boys took to the streets in Atlanta and just randomly beat black men. Between 25 and 100 blacks were killed, and hundreds were injured in that race riot in Atlanta in 1906. In 1917, several thousand African Americans seeking employment opportunities moved to East St. Louis, Illinois, a historically white city. They all came from the South during the World War. On July 1st, a black man was rumored to have killed a white man. Anti-black violence followed, with whites shooting, beating, and lynching African Americans. Arson against African American homes also occurred. The violence continued for a week. Estimates of deaths range from 400 to 200 African Americans, including some 6,000 blacks who fled East St. Louis. In 1919, it's often called the Red Summer. Race riots erupted in 26 cities during the course of the year, including Washington, D.C., Knoxville, Tennessee, Longview, Texas, Phillips County, Arkansas, Omaha, Nebraska, and Chicago. Many of the riots occurred during the summer months in what was known as that Red Summer. Racial tension was particularly bad in northern cities as white soldiers returning from World War I found that their jobs had been taken by African Americans who had migrated north from the South for economic opportunities. In addition, black soldiers returning from the war became embittered by the lack of civil rights extended to them, particularly after they risked their lives for fighting for their country. Chicago experienced the most violence. On July 22nd, 1919, Eugene Williams, a 17-year-old black man, was swimming with friends in Lake Michigan and entered a white-only area of the water. A group of white men threw rocks at Williams. He was hit in the head and drowned. Police refused to arrest the man who threw the rock, and fighting began when white and black gangs erupted in Chicago's South Side. But violence escalated and the state militia was deployed. Fighting continued until August 3rd, and 15 white people and 23 blacks were killed. About 1,000 blacks lost their homes to arson. And on and on and on, multiple stories regarding this did ensue. At the end of the day, the ways in which blacks resisted this violence was not by being violent. It was by speaking out against discrimination and organizing boycotts and organizing and focusing on developing segregated communities and focusing on developing and improving segregated facilities, and also organizing and creating organizations like the NAACP, which called for the equal treatment of African Americans. So the black response to violence through all of those years was categorically non-violence, and that gave birth to the civil rights movement under the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Joe Loconte.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bradley, and terrific to be here. I learned from all of my colleagues, and also Dr. Rivers, thank you for your remarks, because you always cause me to think a little bit more carefully. So thank you for that as well. I've been asked to talk about 1968, this season of violence, what we can learn from it. 1968 was the year when it seemed that everything in America might just be up for grabs. It was a year of heartbreaking assassinations, protests, police brutality, outbursts of mob violence across the country. But there were other things going on too. I just want to mention a few. The #1 hit song was the Beatles' Paul McCartney's Hey Jude. It was a love song, of course, but it's a love song for a troubled time. Take a sad song and make it better. That's Paul McCartney with the Brooklyn accent, right? Also in 1968, the musical Hair opens up on Broadway with its cosmic anthem, The Age of Aquarius. Here's the first few lines. When the moon is in the 7th house and Jupiter aligns with Mars, then peace will guide the planets and love will steer the stars. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. I see Dr. Tubbs looking a little skeptical over there, but we all know that Dr. Tubbs has many flower power t-shirts still hanging in his closet. Well, one other point there. 1968 also marked the year when my beloved New York Mets finally dragged themselves out of the cellar, last place. They still had a losing record, 73 wins, 89 losses. But the next year, they would turn it around and win the World Series. A stunning, stunning turnaround in baseball history. Maybe there's something in that reversal, though, that reversal of fortunes for us to ponder as we think about 1968 and where we are today and where we're going. So let's get into it. During the 1960s, for the first time in our history, massive protests were led by young people, college students. By 1968, two volatile causes had converged: the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. And with both causes, there's a growing sense of disillusionment with establishment elites, the educational elites, the political elites, who just seem to be completely out of touch. And the anger and frustration were directed across party lines, I want to emphasize. Let's take the issue of race. There's a profound impatience with the pace of change in race relations and civil rights for Black Americans. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., his strategy of nonviolence, it seemed to be vindicated by the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act. In 1967, the Supreme Court ended state bans on interracial marriage. And in the same year, Thurgood Marshall was confirmed by the Senate as the first African-American on the Supreme Court. So progress is being made, but the problems of police brutality, of poverty, lack of access to good education, those difficulties, they all remain. And it's a hot and violent summer in July 1967. Riots in Newark, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, and Detroit, where 43 people were killed and hundreds injured there in Detroit. So the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968, it just sets off a tinderbox. In the 10 days following King's death, nearly 200 cities across the country experienced looting, arson, sniper fire, mob violence. Washington, D.C., where I live, experienced the most damage. 1,200 fires, property damage, around $175 million in today's terms. It's going to take decades for the neighborhoods in D.C. to fully recover, and some still haven't. Take my word on that. And of course, the African-American community was most severely affected by the riots. Lessons, I think, that some, maybe many activists and politicians don't seem to have learned. So in 1968, racial tensions have boiled over, but so has opposition to the Vietnam War. When the Tet Offensive there occurs in 1968, it's obvious that we were not, as the Democratic President Lyndon Johnson claimed, we were not winning the war in Vietnam. And so demonstrators, more than 10,000 of them, descend upon the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Jacob, I think we've got a video clip here you can put up for us.
Militant young activists who have come to Chicago to protest the war seized a statue, and a running 5-hour battle was on. At nightfall, hundreds of helmeted police closed in on Lincoln Park as the demonstrators surged through the streets protesting the park curfew. At least 50 persons were injured, 150 arrested in the club-swinging violence that followed. Police used their nightsticks, tear gas, and chemical mace freely. 14 newsmen were injured, among them CBS News cameraman Del Hall, seen here filming the action.
What about the use of force? Is it necessary to use any force at all?
Oh, to get this mob out of the park, there was no question about it. They were barricaded. They were challenging the police to a confrontation, throwing rocks, obviously with every intention of, if you tried to ask them to go, they weren't going to go, and they were going to fight.
Late today, demonstrators moved out into the streets again, demanding that the Democratic Party discuss the emergency and vowing to confront police again if they enforce the curfew in the park. Many of them, from out of town and out of money, have nowhere to sleep and nothing to lose. John Lawrence, CBS News, Chicago.
So there you have it. Lots of violent elements, we should say, were mixed in with the protesters. Students for a Democratic Society, the Black Panthers, Democratic Mayor Richard Daley, you just saw on the screen, he seemed to give the Chicago police a green light to brutalize the protesters. The National Guard was mobilized and had shoot to kill orders. The whole world is watching, they chanted. The whole world is watching. Well, of course, that's a disaster for the Democratic Party, but more importantly, the psychic impact. It accelerates the erosion of trust in politicians and our political institutions. What can we learn from all this, guys? Quickly, what can we learn from all this? First, I think our leaders must speak into the causes of social unrest. Speak into the causes of it, but speak responsibly, without partisan rancor, with compassion and with moral seriousness. Secondly, identify and delegitimize the violent and extremist groups that attach themselves to social causes and political parties. I think there is some soul searching going on right now in the conservative movement about the problem of white supremacy, as Dr. Rivers drew our attention to that, and Christian nationalism of the country. I think there's some soul searching going on, probably not enough. My question is there a similar moral inventory being conducted within the liberal establishment? Because right now, it doesn't look that way to me. Think about it. In the presidential debate there in Cleveland, Joe Biden dismissed the problem of Antifa as a myth. Mr. Biden said that Antifa is an idea that does not exist as an organization. Well, I got to tell you, it seems to me the president here is in denial, in dangerous denial about this, because Antifa's use of intimidation, violence, and acts of terror most resemble those of the fascists of the 1930s. And I've studied that period. Former Attorney General William Barr said this: I've talked to every police chief in every city where there's been major violence, and they all have identified Antifa as the ramrod for the violence. He's talking about the violent demonstrations over last year. So I don't think this contradicts what Dr. Rivers says. I think it's complementary. These militia forces from the left and from the right, they represent a breakdown in the rule of law, and it's going to take political courage on both sides to call them out. Third lesson from the chaos of 1968, the need to navigate between cynicism and utopianism, between cynicism and utopianism. The cynic only sees the failures, only sees bad motives, and cannot engage with other citizens for the common good. A complete lack of gratitude for any step forward toward a more just society. That's one problem. But then there's a problem of utopianism. This is the chronic temptation to demand the immediate arrival of a perfectly just, prosperous, and egalitarian society. Now, yeah, there are religious utopians among us on the right, but I think the greater threat are from the progressive and secular utopians, those without a Christian conscience, who have put their ultimate hope in a political vision, turning it into an idol. Leon Trotsky put it this way during the bloodletting of the Russian Revolution in 1917. We shall not enter into the kingdom of socialism in white gloves on a polished floor. I hope Bernie Sanders is listening. Whatever else we do, we should ponder carefully Abraham Lincoln's warning at his Lyceum address delivered during another season of lawlessness in the 1830s. Listen to Lincoln. Let every man remember that to violate the law is to trample on the blood of his father and to tear the charter of his own and of his children's liberty. This has always been one of the great challenges of our republic, of our political charter, to preserve both order and freedom. And for the Christian, perhaps this means we need to bring our desire for justice, bring to it a greater measure of mercy. And we've got no better example, of course, than Jesus himself, our great teacher and savior, who came from the Father with grace and truth. Thanks for listening. Let me turn it over back to Dr. Rivers.
Well, thank you so much. There's so much here to think about and to ponder. And I just want to remind everybody that if you have questions, you can text them to this number, 646-355-8946, 646-355-8946. And I would just like to say, go to the questions in the chat. Several questions have come in regarding Black Lives Matter, and so I'm going to start there. One question is extremely long, so I will shorten it. Are we inviting the harmful practice of summarily labeling people as being part of one group or another based on limited facts such as who they voted for? Where does the love of Christ in these discussions, where is the love of Christ in these discussions to unify us around the ideologies we know are of Christ rather than finding whom to blame? So I think since I launched with that, I'm going to speak to that, and then I'm going to ask you perhaps, Dr. Loconte, to go next because you spoke to this as well, and anybody else who wants to respond to this question. I think it's very important for us to recognize the love of Christ in all of this. We need to be motivated by the love of Christ, but there could not have been a more searing denunciation of evil than Christ when he spoke to the political leaders of his day, the religious leaders who were also political figures of his day, and called them whitened sepulchres. He basically said, you are rotten, stinking bones, looking good on the outside. He denounced their behavior in no uncertain terms. And I think it's important for us, especially in an age where truth is under attack from the right and from the left. It's an era in which people on the left claim that a man is a woman because he says so, and people on the right deny scientific facts. So in an era where truth is under attack, it is important for us to try to understand where the violence is being perpetuated. And it is striking that this FBI report, so one from the FBI and one from the Department of Homeland Security, do not mention Antifa at all in discussing terrorism, and do not mention Black Lives Matter. Now, the report was written before the well, actually, the report came out at the end of 2020. So already we had all of those massive Black Lives Matter demonstrations. It is fairly clear that when it comes to what has cost lives and raised violence in the United States, white supremacists have much more been at fault. The one part of the question, someone else asked about economic impact. I've not seen any reports evaluating economic impact. Certainly there was a lot of destruction associated with Black Lives Matter protests. So it's possible that Black Lives Matter protests, even though they were overwhelmingly peaceful, but the violence probably had a greater economic impact. I want to turn it to you, Dr. Loconte. Do you want to address this question?
Sure, Dr. Rivers, thank you. Just and very briefly, because I want to hear actually from my other colleagues here on this. One of the ways I think we demonstrate the love of Christ in the public square is that we're honest brokers. I absolutely agree. The truth question, speaking truth into the situation in an even-handed, nonpartisan way, seems to me one of the great needs of the hour among our statesmen. And I'm thinking historically now to another period of intense violence, sectarian violence, actually, 16th and 17th century, the religious violence between Catholics and Protestants. And a guy named Jacob Acontius wrote a tract he was a Protestant, going after both the Catholics and the Protestants as they were engaged in a religious war, these religious sectarian wars. He was not a popular guy, but he was an amazing, seems to me, person of faith with integrity and courage, willing to call out both sides. So in terms of the love of Christ, if you're not willing to do that, I'm not sure the love of Christ is really in the equation on that. Turn it over to my friends.
Dr. Bradley.
Yeah, I'll speak to this briefly. Much of this stems because Christians need to consider the possibility or maybe the invitation of not identifying their sort of primary allegiance as a Christian to a political ideology, right? That's the problem on the right or the left. You cannot say that I'm a Christian, therefore I'm a Democrat. You can't say that. You can't say because I'm a Christian, I'm a Republican. You cannot say that, right? Because both the right and the left, Democrats and Republicans, all of those ideologies, right, tend toward idolatry, right? They all promise things to sort of sort of in a Gnostic way. They sort of promise to address evil, and they provide a salvation story of public policy that can never deliver on what it promises. And Christians have been seduced on the right and the left to pledging allegiance to things that don't presuppose the existence of the triune God. And so I think the love of Christ, the love of God, the love of the Holy Spirit, once we begin to disassociate ourselves from ideology and to really invest in our citizenship in the kingdom first, then we're given freedom to speak truth to both the left and the right and the middle. To me, that's much of the birthplace of moving beyond these things.
Here, here, Dr. Bradley. Anybody else, any of our other speakers want to? Okay, then yes, go ahead, Dr. Tubbs.
So I appreciate all the comments we just heard. I would just emphasize this, which I take from my study of history. There are times in history, the United States, other parts of the world, in which norms of civility, procedural norms are very strong, well established. And in those circumstances, it's easier to acknowledge differences on matters of policy, party differences, and so forth. But there are other times in which the procedural norms and the sense of mutual respect are greatly diminished. And in those circumstances, I really believe it's incumbent on all persons of goodwill to try to emphasize what they have in common with their fellow citizens, rather than being obsessed with or preoccupied with differences. You see it this way, I see it that way. How about emphasizing many of the things that we share in common? If we could emphasize those things that we share in common, then it just might bring the collective temperature down a bit.
Well, that's a great lead into the next question, which is to Dr. Parks. Is a kind of bipartisan agreement Washington achieved possible today? If so, what can we take away from Washington's example for how we move away from extremes to a more moderate understanding, assuming that being moderate is better than being extreme?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. And, I think Dr. Loconte was really addressing this as well in his analysis of a later period, that there's a real importance at this stage for there to be policing of the left by the left and policing of the right by the right. And I think if there's one thing that we can take away from this time, really building upon the responses to the previous question, that's in a hyper-partisan age, in a tribal age, which is the age we're in, then the tendency is always, and how easy is it, to point out the faults of your opponents, right? They're all hypocrites. They don't live up to the standards that they announce. They don't live up to your standards. And we're very good at pointing out the speck in the eye of everybody else. And of course, we have this massive log protruding from our own eye. So I think that's something that we can learn from these historical examples, where you see efforts to appreciate, to build on what Dr. Tubbs was just saying, points of commonality, right? And one of the things that Washington did well, I think, in the example that I cited, was to isolate those that were the most intransigent, those who were committed to violence, from this other group that kind of got swept up in it, right? And to be able to draw reasonable distinctions between those that are actually responsible for this violence and those that aren't, right? And it would be very helpful in our own day if we can distinguish those that are committed to violence, to doing harm, to all kinds of trouble and disorder, from those who have a political ideology we just don't like, right? And efforts to draw those kinds of lines will be repaid with the growing emergence of a sense of, yeah, there actually is a common good here. And the group in the middle is actually pretty big if we get out of those silos that allow us to focus on one particular ideology and one group, and begin to see that there's actually quite a number of people that are willing to lay down their arms rhetorically and physically and pursue common enterprises for the common good.
And I think that leads nicely into a question which I think is best directed to Dr. Tubbs, and which echoes a question I have. So it seems as though President Trump had the possibility to act as Washington did, as Dr. Parks just pointed out, quelling the clearly rising tide of violence among his supporters prior to January 6th, but he chose to do otherwise. And so the question is, as our founding fathers saw the impeachment process as political, about high crimes and misdemeanors rather than regular crimes, does Trump's speech have to breach the fighting words or clear and present danger standard to be considered impeachable? Even though it might not pass the test at the Supreme Court, surely it might still be impeachable.
That's a valuable question, and I agree that it could. The President Trump's conduct could be impeachable, even if the speech that he gave on January 6th did not meet the criteria, the two-part test put forth in Brandenburg versus Ohio. That is, it may have been constitutionally protected speech if we look at the text of the speech, everything he said there. But all these other matters, his continued refrain that the election had been rigged, stolen, so forth. This is, I think, deeply problematic. And one might say that the repeated failure to win a single case in court, the Trump administration was in court a lot, kept losing. The only thing I've heard on that particular point that I think Trump supporters might still cite, Senator Rand Paul said this recently, well, most of these issues were decided on the question of standing. The courts did not get to the merits of the point of dispute. Be that as it may, the point is there was not a single victory in the court system. And the fact that there were a string of losses, I think would have led most people to say, look, we're unlikely to have the results of the presidential election from November 2020 overturned. And so we just must accept this fact. So I accept the point that's being raised by the person who posed that question.
That this, in fact, might be impeachable.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, excellent. So someone is asking a question, which it's true, I don't think any of us has addressed. It is interesting there's been no mention of the political violence committed against indigenous people of this land from the very origins of this nation. Point well taken. Could a few people speak to the idea that America itself was founded by those who committed political violence for their own interests and framed it as virtuous? I leave that to the historians. I think the point is well taken, but yes, Dr. Tubbs.
I just say one thing very quickly. I wanted to say this at some point in my presentation, I just couldn't fit it in. So I do not think that anybody could seriously maintain that chattel slavery was not an institution characterized by violence. There is political violence associated with the institution of chattel slavery, unmistakably. The myth of the paternalistic slaveholder has long been debunked. It was a relationship in which violence adhered every day. First point. Second point, about the plight of Native Americans, also well taken. However, I go back to something that Dr. Loconte said. Cynicism is the view that everybody's acting in bad faith, that everyone's acting in bad faith. I do believe when we tell the history of the United States, we must give a lot of attention to American ideals. We must also acknowledge the gap between ideals and reality, but ideals and institutions are part of the story as well. And all institutions, I think it's very easy for Christians to acknowledge this, all institutions are going to fall short of our expectations of them. But ideals must be part of the story. And the ideals of the American founding, I would insist, are noble ideals. They're noble ideals, and we've been aspiring to reach those ideals for all of our history.
Dr. Loconte.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Rose. It's a terrific question, terrific point, and I guess I want to say a couple things quickly. You could definitely argue that the story of American democracy, there's kind of twin narratives. You've got the story of repression, slavery, racism, but then this other narrative of equality and freedom, right? Equal justice under the law. And I always want to say, as an historian, it was pretty bad in those periods there. We're talking about the indigenous Americans, Native Americans, Black Africans, Black Americans, pretty bad. And then you always want to ask, well, and then compared to what exactly during the same time period in other parts of the world? Well, compared to what's going on in other parts of the world, it's pretty much on a par in a lot of ways. Here's a distinctive thing in my mind as an historian is what the founders put in place was a system that allowed for an incredible capacity for reform and for protest and for the prophetic voice to speak. And the prophetic voice, especially from our perspective, that's the Christian voice. When Christian communities could lead the demand for change. And that has happened in the United States in ways that the closest parallel would really be Great Britain, which also has had a very vibrant and Christian civil society. But outside of Great Britain, it's hard to think of other countries with the same capacity to challenge the establishment, to try to get the country to live up to its highest ideals. And the founders put that system in place with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So let me just leave it there.
So with that, we are out of time. I want to express my thanks to Dr. Tubbs, Dr. Parks, Dr. Bradley, Dr. Loconte, and most of all to King's College for engaging this very important topic. Very timely, very sensitive, and so important to bring together voices which have such different perspectives. Thank all of my colleagues for their excellent presentations. And I want to thank those who've taken the time to participate in this, to ask questions, to listen and to think about it. Because as one of the questions pointed out, this question of listening to voices which are different, which don't share your opinion, so important to work against the extremism. So thank you, everyone, and God bless you.